these incredible student activists. So we're going to turn it over to them, and we have with us Wagatwe, and she's a fabulous activist from Tufts, and Dana, whom I already introduced, and John Kelly, who is also coincidentally a fabulous activist from Tufts. Other things that they've done in addition to Know Your Nine was to create EdAct Now, which was to demand that the Ed department publish, have better transparency, publish its results of its investigations, and a lot of this would not have happened without these fabulous activists. So welcome, and thank you for being here. So I think I'll start with Wagatwe, and tell us whatever you want to tell us about your activist experience and how the internet has been used as how you've used it as an organizing tool.
Yeah. Can you? Hi. So I started college in 2004. I was supposed to graduate in 2008. And I learned about Title IX when I think it was like 2009, and I reported at Tufts, and they didn't do anything about the report. They pretended they were gonna help me, and they didn't. Essentially, we started organizing for a better sexual assault policy, and they ended up expelling me and not accommodating me. So I felt really disempowered, and I didn't really know what to do and how to support the campaign that was continuing at Tufts while I was at home. So I taught myself how to make a website. I learned how to register a domain. I had like $6 to my name, and I bought a domain on sale for 89 cents. And yeah, I taught myself how to, make the website look really pretty, et cetera, and I taught myself how to use Facebook and Twitter and social media, essentially just to share my story and expose rape culture on Tufts campus. And it was actually a really great tool because I ended up being connected to individuals like Dana and John. Essentially, what was going on for a very long time is that administrators were taking advantage of the fact that there was a high turnover of students, right? Like a student would be on campus for 4 to 5 years, and they could just use the same excuses over and over again, and they try to pretend it's an individual problem. So like when Tufts talked about me, they're like, oh, well, if only you reported sooner, et cetera, but I spoke to another survivor who reported right away, and they didn't treat her very well either. So the internet was basically a way for us to show that, hey, this is a systemic problem across the board. And it gave us opportunity to exchange best practices. You have some institutional memory and being like, hey, administrators did this in the past, don't fall for this tactic, because, oh, let's have a committee, this will change things. Administrators love to propose committees that don't do anything. So I think this movement's been going on for a very long time, and a lot of people don't know this. So how old am I? I'm 28. And I've been working on this for a number of years, and someone before me has been working on it, and she brought me into this movement, and her name's Laura Dunn, and she's the executive director of a nonprofit called Serve Justice. So, and there's been people before her, and I think we need to realize that it wasn't really necessarily a new movement, it's just that now people are paying attention, and I think a big reason why is because of the internet. We've been able to share our stories on our own terms and make people listen to us, and I think that's why we have something like the Hunting Ground today, because we just kept talking and people had to listen.
Great. Great. And Dana, do you want to tell us about the founding of Know Your Nine, or anything else you want to start off with?
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm Dana. I am also a survivor. I was in an abusive relationship my sophomore year of college. And when I met other survivors of my abuser, I finally went forward to tell someone on campus about it. I told my college dean, and his advice was to go home, take time off. He actually told me to get a job at Starbucks and then return to campus when my abuser had graduated. Yeah. So I did take time off, and it was only through really a chance meeting with the fabulous pro bono attorneys at the Victim Rights Law Center in Boston that I learned about Title IX and that it applied to me and protected me as a survivor of rape and stalking and abuse. And so when I came back to campus, I started meeting with other survivors at school and talking to them, and again kept hearing that, first of all, survivors had no idea that this law, Title IX, applied to them and what its protections spelled out for them. And second of all, that as a result, they weren't able to stand up for themselves and demand better treatment on campus. And so after a lot of conversations, both on my campus and then with folks like Wagatwe and John, and many others all across the country, I and several other students decided to co-found the organization Know Your Nine, which is a survivor-led, student-driven campaign to end sexual and dating violence on college campuses. So Know Your Nine's work is really twofold. We both bring the law and sort of all its complexity and unwieldiness down from sort of the national level to students on college campuses, and sort of give it to them in manageable pieces that they can really use on their campuses in their cases for justice and safety. And at the same time, we bring students and survivors' voices from the ground up to the folks sort of at the national policymaking tables who are making decisions about the future of Title IX and what this law looks like. I think one of the most important things to us about the organization and about the work moving forward is that it's very survivor-centered. There are a lot of people out in this country who have a lot of thoughts about what survivors should do and what policies should look like. And at the end of the day, as I know everyone in this room knows, survivors need to be at the center of those efforts. So one thing that we're working on right now is opposing a trend all across the country of state legislators, who may be well-intentioned or not, trying to force campus officials to turn rape reports over to the police without survivors' consent. And this is a policy that might sound really great to some people and that I think a lot of really well-intentioned folks are working on. But at the end of the day, we know that when survivors are told that they don't have control over their life and over sort of the processes that they're made to enter into, that chills reporting. And especially when we're thinking about the Title IX context, we know that if survivors know that their Title IX coordinator has to turn over their reports to the police, that's going to chill reporting to Title IX coordinators. And that means that students won't be getting the Title IX mandated services that they need and deserve and have a right to. I think I might pause there and turn to John.
Great.
Great, thank you so much. So I guess a little bit about me. I also am a survivor. I was in an abusive relationship in my first year in college, also at Tufts University, and then ended that relationship only on my first day back for my sophomore year to be raped by him again. I went through the process at school. This was in 2012, so things were better. And it was the same administrators that Wagatwe had dealt with at Tufts. And we faced many of the same uphill battles to receiving any kind of support or care from campus. Fast forward a little while, I realized the need for policy changes both at Tufts and nationally, and was able to connect with some of the incredible people like the two here with me today to really try to work on these changes. Something that's really near and dear to my heart is the idea of the perfect victim. So I think that's something that we often see, in films like The Hunting Ground, in articles, in news stories, is a very specific image of who is sexually assaulted. And who is sexually assaulted is cisgender, straight, white women, usually from the upper middle class, usually actually always assaulted by men. And that's just not true. That's not the case. That's not, nearly a full picture of sexual violence on college campuses and beyond. And I think that part of that buys into silence not only of male survivors, genderqueer survivors, trans survivors, as well as survivors of color, low-income survivors, survivors on community colleges, but it also buys into silencing survivors of dating violence, because we have this idea that students at our schools couldn't do this, right? And in some ways, sort of accepting that students at your school could engage in abusive relationships, is a really terrifying thought to students, to administrators, to parents. And I think that that's something that is often missing from the conversation. We're not often talking about what it means to be a survivor of dating violence on college campuses. As I'm sure many of you health professionals know, sort of the area of rape crisis counseling usually shows that it takes about 2 to 5 years to enter out of, sort of like a secondary period of recovery after sexual assault. And so 5 years, if you're raped during your first week out on college campus, means that you will, if you take 4 years to graduate, which by no means all students and especially not all survivors do, you're still going to be feeling the effects of your sexual assault up until the day that you're putting on your cap and gown. And I think that that's something that we often forget, and something that I'm reflecting on as I move towards my graduation. Things are in a lot of ways better, but they're not perfect. And one other point that I wanted to touch on that I think the three of us represent really well is that activism takes so many different forms, and it takes so many different forms over the course of a person's lifetime. It takes so many different forms over the course of a person's college career. And I think that sometimes we denigrate those activists who we see as taking too radical of stances, or on the other side, those who are too assimilationist in their policies, who are working too closely with administrators that we sort of see as the bad guys, which in many cases they are. And I think that can be a really dangerous thing if we're setting up sort of a hierarchy of activism, of showing who is best suited to do this work, what kind of work is the right kind of work. Because, in a social movement like this, it takes all of these different voices to achieve change. If we weren't standing outside the Department of Education yelling, we might not have gotten meetings. If people on the inside, like Lynn Rosenthal, so many of the administrators that we've had talk, we're not doing that work behind the scenes, those meetings might not have happened. And I think that it's really important to remember that this work takes so many different forms.
So that's a perfect segue to thinking about what everyone in this room can do. One thing you can do is support Know Your 9. Just go on their website. They have helped so many survivors, and they send me so many survivors, and we help when we can, but we're completely overwhelmed. So one of the things that the Gender Violence Program is going to partner with Futures Without Violence on is creating a Title IX Institute and also training legal advocates, because it makes a huge difference when you have a lawyer calling the school and saying, hi, we're helping this survivor, and you actually need to accommodate her. And what all of you can do, especially in healthcare as you relate to this, is insist upon different accommodations that will help the survivor keep his or her connection to the school and keep their academic foothold, if you will. And there are ways to do that, to make sure that their grades don't get affected, that they don't have to tell their story more than once, that they get extensions on papers, that they might not have to participate if they can't get out of bed that day, et cetera, et cetera. So you can learn more about accommodations and what you can all do on that on the Know Your 9 website. So now I want to ask each of you what your message is to this audience for activation. What would you like them to do? Are there any takeaway points? Anyone can go.
I can hop in. I always have sort of wonky policy things that are not particularly inspirational, but that are really important. As I'm sure many of you have seen, pro-gun legislators are currently exploiting the work of student activists and calling for gun bans on campuses to be lifted in the name of allowing women to protect themselves from rape. I don't know that dating violence and domestic violence exist in this world for these particular legislators, but there are efforts to stop this, we have I'm being told to wrap up. There is a change.org petition. If you Google any of this, it will pop up, and it would be great if you could sign and call your legislators and tell them to stop doing this.
I think one thing really quickly, and that's something that I've been trying to use my platform that I have now to really emphasize, is that we really need to make sure what kind of survivors we're listening to, and like think about who's at the table and who we're seeing and who's visible, because the type of survivors we're seeing is this implicit message about like who matters in our society, what bodies are valuable, and if we're not saying that all bodies matter, we're gonna let survivors fall to the wayside and feel like they're not important. And we need to have as many people as possible come forward for us to really truly end rape culture.
And then I guess if I had one thing to leave healthcare professionals with who are working with survivors, let them be angry. I think that something that we do way too often is we stifle people's emotional responses because they're not productive. And I think that obviously not everyone has that response to trauma, but it's a very common response. And when healthcare professionals, are asking survivors, are asking people to lower their voices, to remain calm, things like that, it can actually be really damaging. So I guess that's just a thought that I would leave you with.
Great. Great, thank you. And my final point is kind of related to what Dana was saying about current legislation. The criminal justice system is completely separate from Title IX. And everybody really needs to understand that in the criminal justice system, which fails absolutely almost 100% miserably when it comes to prosecuting effectively campus sexual assault, you have a civil right to equal access to educational opportunity on your campus. It's a different thing. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not a crime. The worst that can happen is you get kicked out of school. So be angry and let that anger transform your action.